History has its fair share of horrible kings and emperors who are remembered for their lunacy, stupidity, or cruelty. The list is very long, stretching across time and space from Emperor Nero to Ivan the Terrible, and from Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI to Farouk I of Egypt. However, while some monarchs are known for their depraved morals, other monarchs are known for their sheer incompetence and complete inability to lead their nations in times of peril. One such example of a ruler who was completely out of his depth was the last Tsar of the Russians, Nicholas II. Infamous for bringing about the end of Imperial Russia through his sheer ineptitude, the last of the Romanovs, known also as Bloody Nicholas, is considered in some circles to be the most useless head of state who ever ruled. Today, we will try to answer the question, is Nicholas II the worst monarch in human history? Childhood and preparation for the throne. As the son of the conservative and reactionary, childhood and preparation for the throne. Russian Emperor Alexander III, Nicholas II had a relatively ordinary childhood and adolescence for a Russian crown prince. He was, of course, homeschooled by some of the brightest minds in Russia who taught Nicholas in foreign languages, history, literature, military, economics, and religious and political sciences, among other disciplines. There was nothing remarkable about the upbringing of the young Nicky, as he was informally known in the family. He studied, hung out with his peers from other royal families, traveled abroad, and led a generally careless life befitting a child of his high station. One event, however, likely affected Nicholas's character and worldview significantly. His grandfather, Tsar Alexander II, was assassinated by members of the anti-monarchist Narodnaya Volya movement during a bombing attack in St. Petersburg on March 13, 1881. It should be noted that Alexander II was known as one of the most reformist tsars in Russian history, and both his son and grandson blamed his death on the fact that he had given much power to the plebs at the expense of his own absolutism. Indeed, all Russian monarchs saw their absolute power as a God-given right and believed they had been invested with a holy God-given duty to rule the people. Following Alexander II's assassination, Nicholas officially became a crown prince. He served a few years in the army and, by all accounts, enjoyed a boisterous life as a Russian officer. However, his father gradually started bringing him into governance and politics to prepare him for his future as the Russian Tsar. After that, it did not take long for him to become the new Tsar, as in 1894, at the age of 26, he replaced his late father on the throne. Early blunders and Kodinka tragedy. Early blunders almost immediately. Upon assuming the throne, Nicholas II showed his true colors when it came to how he intended to rule Russia. It is important to understand that even though the Russian Empire was considered a European superpower, the royal Romanov family had no intention of sharing their power with the Russian people. The Russian Empire did not have a constitution or a parliament. For generations, powerful pro-European liberal circles from within the Russian intelligentsia, military, bourgeoisie, and nobility had hoped that every new incoming Tsar would finally agree to liberal reforms. Still, these reforms rarely came and never stuck. Nicholas II was no different. In his first public appearance, he said, "I am aware that recently, in some of the Zemstvo assemblies, voices have been heard of people carried away by senseless dreams of the participation of representatives of the Zemstvos in the internal affairs of the government. Let all know that I shall devote all my strength to the good of the people, but I shall uphold the principle of autocracy just as firmly and unswervingly as did my unforgettable late father." This speech shattered the dreams or perhaps illusions of the Russian liberal and progressive circles. One of the leaders of the Cadet Party, Obninsky, would later write that the Tsar's speech marked not only the beginning of a general disillusionment with Nicholas, but also laid the foundation for the future liberation movement, uniting Zemstvo activists and inspiring them with a more resolute course of action. However, while the liberal intelligentsia and more politicized minority may have been disillusioned with Nicholas II's speech, he, just like any Tsar, was adored by ordinary Russians and seen almost like a divine figure. Despite this, Nicholas II would see his image of Batyushka Tsar, or Father Tsar, damaged early on in his reign. In May 1896, he and his German-born wife, Alexandra Fyodorovna, were in Moscow for their coronation. To celebrate the occasion, a free feast was organized for the people at the Kodinsko Pole. Yet soon the celebration turned into a tragedy, as the frantic mass of people clamoring for free food turned into a riot, and more than 1,300 people died in the stampede. Nicholas's appearance at a French-hosted ball the next day did not help matters, as the young Tsar was now seen as a ruler who was enjoying himself, while his people were suffering. Russo-Japanese War and 1905 Revolution, War and the Revolution Vol. I. The following years of Nicholas II's reign were rather uneventful. Things were quiet at home with no real change or any indication of the imminence of the revolution. Just like his predecessors, Nicholas II was keen on playing the game of imperialism, being particularly active in expanding Russia's sphere of influence in China and the Far East in general. This put him on a collision course with Japan, and a war between the two nations started in 1904. Overconfident in a victory over what it saw as a backward Asian nation, Russia instead suffered a humiliating defeat. The army of the Tsar lost all the major battles in the war, saw a significant portion of its navy decimated, and suffered a major blow to its economy in the process. The technological inferiority of the Russian Empire, most clearly visible in its logistical challenges, was laid bare in the Russo-Japanese War. At a time when other great powers were industrializing and building their railroad infrastructure rapidly to maximize their economic output and be ready to move their armies quickly. In case of war, Russia was still largely an agrarian country, depending on an incomplete Trans-Siberian railway for logistics. Part of this was simply due to the vastness of Russia, but slow industrialization was also caused by the autocratic nature of the Romanov dynasty, including the reign of Nicholas II, who resisted reforms that could have empowered entrepreneurship due to fears of decentralization and consequent political demands. The humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War and the economic problems caused by it were partially responsible for further tension in the Russian Empire. In late December, workers of St. Petersburg went on a mass strike that paralyzed life in the capital. However, Nicholas II and his government only started to truly lose control following the events which would later be called Bloody Sunday. On January 22, 1905, a huge procession of workers led by an Orthodox priest named Gapon began moving towards the imperial residence of the Winter Palace to present their petition asking for political, economic, and educational reforms, including the creation of a parliament. Many demonstrators carried the portraits of Nicholas II, which was an indication of their continued belief in the benevolence of their father Tsar. But their illusions were shattered when imperial troops opened fire on them, killing hundreds of workers. This ignited a revolution, with demonstrations, strikes, terror, and ethnic strife spreading throughout the Russian Empire. Attempts to suppress the revolution were in vain, and the bankruptcy of the absolutist Romanov monarchy against the powerful societal forces demanding changes in the Russian Empire was apparent. Unable to suppress the revolution, Nicholas II reluctantly signed the October Manifesto in 1905, granting the constitution and civil rights to the people of the Russian Empire and promising to hold elections to the legislative body known as the Duma. Until the last moment, Nicholas II was against granting civil and political rights to his subjects, saying, "I cannot squander a legacy that is not mine to squander," in reference to centuries of the absolutist rule by the Romanov dynasty, and blaming his prime minister Witte for this terrible decision as described in his diary. However, Nicholas II clearly saw the October Manifesto as a temporary measure to appease the Russian public before he could roll back the promises of reforms. A few months after proclaiming the October Manifesto, he signed the fundamental laws in April 1906, which stipulated that the emperor must confirm any laws adopted by the Duma. He then dissolved the first and the second Dumas, which became the center of opposition against the absolutist rule. He changed the electoral laws, ensuring a higher degree of loyalty from the third and fourth Dumas to the throne. Simultaneously, Tsar Nicholas appointed Pyotr Stolypin as the prime minister. Stolypin, a conservative statesman often compared to Bismarck for his vision and actions, played a key role in suppressing dissent and solidifying the absolutist rule for one last time, but also in enacting many overdue reforms to ease the tensions in the country. Stolypin gained popularity in conservative and moderate circles for his successful reforms. However, instead of relying on Stolypin as a chance to save his absolutist rule from demise, the insecure Nicholas was growing restless with his popular and strong-willed prime minister. The Tsar once wrote in his diary, "Stolypin imagines himself to be indispensable." Rasputin, Alexei's illness, and court scandals. Rasputin, however, the biggest cause of tensions between Nicholas II and Stolypin was not purely political. It was about a mysterious and shady man who became a spiritual guide and a part-time doctor for the Romanov family. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, an ordinary peasant from Tobolsk, Siberia, gained access to the royal family through the combination of masterful manipulation, natural charisma, and an astonishing degree of happenstance. At one point in his life, Rasputin decided to dedicate himself to religion, going on pilgrimages to holy Christian sites in Russia, Greece, and Jerusalem. As a result, he earned a reputation back home in Siberia as both a pious man and a mystic with a healing touch. By the time Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg in 1903, his aura, as the kids would call it these days, helped Rasputin to secure meetings with Russia's clerical elite. This, in turn, paved the way for the emergence of a close relationship with two Montenegrin princesses living in the Russian court, Milika and Anastasia, who had a very keen interest in religious mysticism. In 1905, Nicholas II and his empress Alexandra Fyodorovna met with Rasputin for the first time when they visited Milika and Anastasia for tea. Both Nicholas and Alexandra were already very religious people and were apparently impressed by Rasputin's charisma and holiness. However, the illness of the Crown Prince Alexei gave Rasputin an opportunity to gain a true breakthrough in his relationship with the royal family and the empress. Nicholas's son had been born with hemophilia, a hereditary blood illness which prevents proper blood clotting. This meant that any minor injury to the crown prince could result in excessive bleeding and death. At the time, there was no treatment for hemophilia, and doctors often prescribed aspirin to any patient with pain and fever. Since aspirin was a blood thinner, the fact that he was more than likely fetid made the crown prince's condition worse. In 1907, Alexei was having another hemorrhage, and his doctors were struggling to stop it. Desperate for any help she could get, Empress Alexandra sent a telegram to Rasputin asking for his aid. Rasputin replied, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die." The hemorrhage eventually stopped, but it did after Rasputin's telegram. The deeply religious Alexandra was convinced that this was a divine intervention brought about by Rasputin's prayers. This ostensible miracle was Rasputin's ticket into the inner circle of the royal family. He became Alexandra Fyodorovna's closest confidant and spiritual guide. In the upcoming years, Alexei continued suffering from hemophilia, and now the empress was listening to Rasputin, not to doctors. Rasputin advised the empress not to give Alexei any medicine and to rely on prayers and rest instead. Historians believe that this meant that the crown prince stopped taking aspirin, which ultimately helped him. Whatever the case, the empress believed that Rasputin had a healing hand. Gradually, he gained an outsized influence over Alexandra, and indirectly over Nicholas II. Rasputin's reported promiscuous character and closeness with the empress caused scandalous rumors. His rumored influence over political decision-making, which was peddled by the opposition, made matters only worse for Nicholas II. Even other members of the Romanov family, including Nicholas II's mother, Empress Maria Fyodorovna, were deeply troubled by Rasputin's influence and his damage to the prestige of the monarchy. Consequently, they called on the royal couple to send Rasputin away. Despite this, Rasputin remained close to the court, and anyone who opposed him was ostracized from the inner circle. World War I, Stavka Command and Home Front Crisis, War and the Revolution Vol. 2. By 1914, Stolypin had been killed, and Rasputin was as influential as ever, but the situation in the Russian Empire seemed stable. However, the outbreak of World War I changed everything. The Austrian Crown Prince Franz Ferdinand was killed. Austria declared war on Serbia, and Russia, the self-proclaimed protector of Slavic and Orthodox nations, decided to intervene. This had a snowball effect, as Europe at the time was entangled in the web of intricate alliance systems and thus found itself suddenly embroiled in a massive continental war. In hindsight, it would be easy to blame Nicholas II for making this ultimately destructive choice for himself, his family, and Russia. But at that point, public opinion in Russia was in favor of an intervention, and Russia's pledges to its allies meant that it could not stay out of the war. In fact, Tsar Nicholas even wrote a heartfelt letter to his cousin, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, to prevent him from entering the war, but it was too little too late. A dark sense of inevitability gripped Europe, as if the continent itself were sleepwalking toward catastrophe, each empire bound by pride, fear, and alliance, unable to halt the march to a war everyone foresaw yet no one could stop. The Great War laid bare all the massive problems Russia had, but had been able to contain and sweep under the rug. Throughout the conflict, Russia struggled against a more technologically advanced German army. The Russian military was in a bad shape and suffered from supply shortages. The empire's inadequate railway network and the ever-present logistics problem of her vast size meant that the humongous Russian army was badly supplied. The home front was in a bad shape too, as supply problems caused food and fuel shortages in cities, including the capital of St. Petersburg. Hunger was creeping in, accompanied by an absence of decisive victories in the main European theater. The initially supportive populace gradually became indifferent towards war, or even worse, hostile. To make matters worse, the Russian army suffered a series of defeats throughout the summer of 1915, which would later be known as the Great Retreat. Simultaneously, Alexandra Feodorovna was getting paranoid about the popularity of the emperor's uncle, Commander-in-Chief Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, and was convinced that the beloved general was intending to usurp her husband's throne. The empress continuously advised the Tsar to take over the command of the army personally. In the end, Nicholas II listened to his wife's advice, despite the fact that his mother, his ministers, and the chairman of the Duma all practically begged him not to do it, understanding that any defeats on the battlefield would now be blamed directly on the Tsar. Nicholas ignored them all, and in August 1915, the Tsar assumed the role of the commander-in-chief of the Russian army. In hindsight, this was arguably one of the most significant steps that eventually led to the downfall of the Romanov dynasty. The emperor started spending most of his days in the Stavka, the headquarters of the army in Mogilev, personally taking part in the planning of the war. During this time, the Russian army carried out the Brusilov offensive, its biggest breakthrough in World War I. But this could not reverse the overall trend. The Russian army was suffering from massive losses. It had the largest absolute number and the highest ratio of soldiers surrendering in World War I, and desertion and mutinies were becoming more common. The discontent at home grew due to a very poor economic situation and supply shortages. Worker strikes in vital plants and factories had a further paralyzing effect on manufacturing and political stability. At this point, Nicholas II was practically uninvolved in civilian matters, leaving the unpopular empress as the de facto leader of Russia with Rasputin as her closest advisor. The deterioration of the situation on the battlefield and at home, Alexandra Feodorovna's German origins and Rasputin's known opposition to the war proliferated rumors that they were German spies among the Russian public. The political situation was very unstable, as exemplified by the fact that Nicholas II changed his prime ministers 4 times during 1916. The majority of the previously loyal Duma united in a progressive bloc in 1915, demanding a representative government. But this would have meant giving up some of the power, which was unacceptable for Nicholas II, an absolutist to his core. By doing this, The Tsar squandered perhaps the last chance at a peaceful change in the Russian Empire. All this unrest eventually snowballed into a revolution, which was much more powerful than the 1905 revolution and carried out against a much weaker regime. Soldiers and the police loyal to the monarchy tried to suppress the growing revolutionary movement, but the situation was getting out of control. Military units abandoned Nicholas II and switched sides in favor of the revolutionaries. The Duma leadership made several attempts to ask Nicholas II to accept a new government responsible for the Duma, which the Tsar, of course, rejected because of absolutism, traditions, and his duty to the Russian people bestowed upon him by God. An attempt to suppress the mutiny by soldiers sent from the World War I fronts did not amount to anything. At this point, Russia's military high command also understood the gravity of the situation, calling upon Nicholas II to abdicate to save the country. Without any allies left, Nicholas II signed an abdication, not just for himself, but also for his son, on March 2nd. February Revolution and Abdication 1917, 1917. He named his brother Grand Duke Michael his successor, but the latter refused the crown. The February Revolution had won. The power was now in the hands of the provisional government. The Romanov dynasty, which had reigned over Russia for more than 300 years, had fallen. A year later, Nicholas II, his wife, and their children were executed by the Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg. Verdict on Nicholas II's reign. Conclusion. So, was Nicholas II the worst monarch in history? There were certainly kings who have killed more people, as well as rulers who may have been more oppressive towards their subjects or ruled more incompetently. So it is difficult to grant Nicholas II this questionable honor of naming him the worst monarch ever. But he is certainly up there in the conversation. Nicholas II found himself completely out of his depth, facing challenges of historical proportions. His stubbornness and inability to properly grasp the processes going on in Russia ultimately led to his and his family's demise. Perhaps, had he been more pragmatic and less conservative in his blind stubbornness to insist on absolutist rule, his dynasty could have been saved. Had he followed the advice of smart people around him, he would not have allowed questionable characters such as Rasputin hanging around the court and damaging the reputation of the royal family. Nicholas II's reign is a story of a succession of wrong and disastrous decisions, each worse than the previous one, which had an impact big and small on the Russian Empire, ultimately accumulating into a revolution, the fall of the Russian Empire, and a bloody civil war. While his score sheet at the end of his reign may not make him the worst monarch in all of history, it certainly puts him up there in the top percentile. We hope you enjoyed this video. More like it are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and press the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTuber Embers can watch more than 200 plus exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos. Learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, ND much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.